When Heart of the Swarm came out, there was a hype in the StarCraft 2 scene that had not been seen since the Wings of Liberty release. And this was incredibly interesting because the end of Wings of Liberty had grown very stale, and the Broodlord Infestor meta had reigned supreme, and Blizzard sort of said, well, since it's a paid expansion, we're just going to leave Wings of Liberty in its current state with Broodlord Infestor being very powerful, which everybody hated. So when the beta came out, everyone flooded over to that, and all of the final Wings of Liberty tournaments were sort of not as exciting, and people were definitely ready to move on to Heart of the Swarm. The final Wings of Liberty GSL was won by the player that we're going to be seeing today, RorO, a very talented, under-the-radar Zerg player. This was a Kespa guy that switched over right before Wings of Liberty ended, and we can see their win-loss here. These are their last 10 matches that they played. These are Pro League games back when that was still around, and the GSL games. See some interesting games here as RorO played against Flash, Sky High, who was an underrated Terran player that never really took off, Tasia, who won a ton of foreign tournaments, Bomber, who was at a bunch of foreign tournaments, perennial MLG threat, MVP, the best Terran in Wings of Liberty, Marine King, one of the most beloved players in StarCraft history. On the right, we have Startail Life and Jaedong, two of the most decisive aggressive Zergs ever. Effort, the Brood War legend. Hyun, a tournament winner who was exceptional. Action, who we see competing in Brood War tournaments, the ASL even to this day. Solar, a longtime GSL round of 8 caliber player. And Symbol, who I always think about as being sort of very similar to RorO in the sense that these were guys who really were getting good at the end of Wings of Liberty, and I don't think you could really call them patch Zergs because their talent and their ability to win sort of extended into the Heart of the Swarm era, whereas some guys like Johnny Recco really were just all about the patch and couldn't win without Broodlord Infestor. The truth is, a lot of Zergs hated Broodlord Infestor after it had been meta for months and months. Not every Zerg player wants to spend an hour playing every single ZVT, making 50 spine crawlers, going split map, but it was so much better than everything else that if you wanted to win tournaments, that's what you had to do. The games devolved into these terrible stalemates that were hideously boring. And something that's interesting to note is in a previous cast years ago, it was an old Life cast, I said that Life played MVP in the final Wings of Liberty GSL and won, and he did in fact do that, but it wasn't the final Wings of Liberty GSL. The final Wings of Liberty GSL was a ZVZ that RorO won, which was the previous one. So that happened in like January and February of 2013. This is in March and April of 2013. Remember, HOTS dropped in March in 2013. Pretty much everyone had switched over, and to the beta tournaments. People were so tired of Wings, they were really using the beta to play tournament matches. So whenever the Legacy was set and released, as far as the Heart of the Swarm beta and the Wings of Liberty, that sort of era was cemented as we jump into the map here on Daybreak. Daybreak, of course, a legacy map from the original Wings of Liberty. You gotta love it. This was the de facto macro map. This was the map that if you wanted to prove you were better than someone, you played on. This was the map that if you were going to 1v1 and show how good you were, you picked this. It wasn't gimmicky. It was the straight up standard map that really is the most played map in StarCraft 2 history because it was being spammed heavily through the mid and late Wings of Liberty era. It's one of these maps that the pro gamers are never going to veto. They're always going to veto the weird map. You had to learn how to play on this one. So I love that this map is going to be the first pick. This map also had a ton of famous matches on it, really too many to go into. This is just an absolute classic map. This and Belshir Vestige are the two most played maps in StarCraft 2 history, I would say. Because this one got spammed super hard in Wings of Liberty and was considered the standard macro map, and then it got spammed at the beginning of Heart of the Swarm. This thing just would not die. There's Innovation. It's a little bit less cold in Korea as the spring was starting. He's not in that really puffy classic STX Soul jacket. He's in a thinner one. So will RorO be able to win versus Innovation? Because at this point, Innovation was seen as a god. Not only the best Terran, but the de facto best player. If we remember the round of 16 groups that I casted and were the previous matches of this series, I highly encourage you to watch the series chronologically. There is a playlist, and I always try to link the games. They're very easy to find, but you should be watching the series chronologically. But anyway, Life was just dismantled by Innovation, and he was seen as either the second best player to Innovation or above Innovation in an era where all the Brood War gods had transitioned fully. And Life was definitively the best Zerg, even though RorO had won the previous GSL title. Life was really the one that people looked up to and respected. And Innovation ran through absolute legends. Rain, the best Brood War macro Protoss ever in the round of 32. And then Hyun, who's very solid. And a guy who was always a threat to win a foreign tournament anytime he showed up. And was sort of underrated. Another guy that sort of gets lost in the sauce a bit. This era of Zerg, RorO, Hyun, Symbol, these guys are sort of dismissed as patch Zergs, which isn't right because a lot of them aren't really patch Zergs, because even though they were really good at Wings of Liberty, it doesn't mean that it was all because of the Broodlord Infestor era. A patch Zerg is like a really nasty term, almost like a slur for a StarCraft player, where you're sort of saying that a Zerg player is only good because of a patch. And that's not really something that gets said anymore. It's an era-specific insult to the late Wings of Liberty era, when we saw ZVZ finals galore. There was an old joke that at the end of the Wings of Liberty era, it was not GOM TV, which was the website that hosted GSL at the time, sort of like what Afrika is now. It was GOM ZVZ, because there were a ton of Zergs, and painfully, since it was very Infestor dominated, and that was what really reigned supreme, the games would always run really long and turn into these ostentatious turtle fests, which, if I've made one point about imbalance, and I'll make it again, it's that aggressive imbalance is more fun to watch and more tolerable for an esport than really defensive turtley imbalance. And I know I'm a macro player, and Idra's my favorite player, but Idra hated the Broodlord Infestor style versus Protoss more than anyone, and in ladder games and on stream would famously and stubbornly go Roach Hydra Corruptor like it was early 2011, which is just fucking terrible. Like, even if your macro is good and you're better than your opponent, if you're playing Protoss, you're hoping they're going Roach Hydra Corruptor. It's so much easier than dealing with mass muta styles, or especially Ling into Infestor styles. If a lot of people don't know this, but Zerg had a lot of trouble with Protoss in the first year or so of Wings of Liberty, especially force field abuse. And at one point in mid 2011, late 2011, Zergs figured out mass muta was sort of the meta against Protoss. And then in 2012, Blizzard came out with the Phoenix Range upgrade. So then Zerg was having a lot of trouble again until mid 2012. That's when the big patch hit. The Overlord got faster, and the Queen got a range increase. This meant that Zerg became way less flimsy. And this had an interesting compounding effect with the fact that since the Wings of Liberty beta all the way up into mid-2012, so that's like March of 2010 to July of 2012, so for 2 years, Zerg had been, frankly, the hardest and flimsiest and worst race, and the race that was easiest to cheese, and the race that you really had to be on the ball about scouting because you could die so easily, especially in the early era of the game, the beta and the first few months of Wings of Liberty, when the map pool was like Steps of War, Lost Temple. Because if we look at StarCraft 2 now, the Zerg always makes Mass Queen. Why? Because creep is important, and because the Queens have a ton of range against ground units and air units. Therefore, they are a very good defensive backbone, no matter what comp your opponent goes for. Your opponent goes for a BC rush and he's going to telly it Rambo style into your natural. Great, you open 5 queens to spread creep, you walk them over. Your opponent opening Hellion like we see Innovation doing now and Innovation do every game, great. Queen's great against Hellions, and you're going to need creep spread no matter what. That's the other defensive backbone of Zerg in any matchup. ZVZ not so much, but the non-mirrors certainly. Liquid TLO, the popular German Zerg, once said that creep spread was the most important element of Terran versus Zerg. That's something that was true in early Wings of Liberty. That's something that's true in Heart of the Swarm, and something that's true in Legacy of the Void. And I have literally went to his stream when he was still a pro gamer and asked him, like, over the years. I would literally pop in every, like, 18 months and be like, TLO, creep spread still the most important part of ZVT? Oh, I would say so, yes. Fucking love Dario. And he was known as a creative guy, and a lot of people forget that TLO had a stretch in early Wings of Liberty where he was playing true random and then ultimately Terran. He started playing Terran because it was less stressful on his wrists. And a lot of that comes down to the fact that Zerg is always trying to spread creep from basically jump. Basically, as soon as Zerg can, they spread creep and boom, a counterattack is eliminated there. Very important to note that Innovation had a bunker building out at that third and had a mine out there as well. It's very important to note that Zerg players love to run lings into your third right when you land it, because all Terran players are banking energy, drop about 8 mules at least on that third, and it's just such a huge power spike and helps you go into your barracks 5 through 8 production and your macro cycles. And if Zerg can run in and kill all those mules and a few workers, it really guts a much needed power spike for the Terran player. Since Innovation had Marines, a bunker, and most importantly a mine out there, the counterattack was gutted. In the previous game of the series on Whirlwind, Startail Life lined up for a huge Lingbane attack at the third. Innovation had a bunker, had a depot, and most importantly had mines. Startail Life sort of sensed this. He's like, well shit, I'm playing Innovation. I know how clean his macro is. He never misses macro cycles. And Innovation was really known for his mine use against Zerg at this time. And we saw against Life, he had the mine at the third just like he did at this point against RorO, which is huge because you prevent those mules from being killed and are able to go into that crushing forward macro push that is hard for Zergs to deal with when they're in there. I'm trying to get to my Muta power trough. And Innovation was really famous for this. Okay, I'm going to open Hellion, get a fast third CC, get about 65 workers, and then start pushing constantly. Get a fast 2-2, and go for a mine-heavy style in an era where the mine was the most powerful it had been in StarCraft 2 history, and absolutely decimated Lingbane Muta. Some of the filthiest, most spectacular splash damage hits were seen in this era, and my god, it was so fun to watch. If you ask me, Venom, what's like your favorite meta or era in StarCraft 2 history? It would be this: Zerg vs Terran, Mutaling Baneling, early Heart of the Swarm, when the Hellbat was still laughably strong, as was the Mine, and the Mine Splash was spectacular. Remember that the Mines can friendly fire too, so even though it was certainly Terran favored, Zergs could sort of make use of it if they microed in clever ways or flanked. We saw some really filthy splash damage a lot of the time, which of course, just like big splash damage onto Zerg units, is really fun to watch. I think that one thing that's interesting about StarCraft 2 is a lot of the things were sort of nerfed down and tampered down to make things less ridiculous, and in Brood War there is stuff that is absolutely absurd, like Plague and Dark Swarm. And on some level I think having everything way tuned up and really powerful and crushing is more fun to watch than everything just sort of being like tuned down to a baseline. And in addition to all the Kespa Koreans switching over and us getting to see the highest influx of talent that we had seen in the scene up to that point, one thing that makes this era interesting is how insanely strong everything was. As far as all these new Heart of the Swarm units came out and we had great players using them and nothing had been tamped down by the nerf bat yet, it was so explosive and exciting because it was a confluence of events, all these exciting new units, all these potentially new tactics we could see people do, and a huge counterattack is being queued up here as a force was stranded up in the top left. RorO's Mutas and Banes were really boxed in there as Inno took a crushing lead. And the weird thing about attacking Innovation is, since he's known for his macro and never missing macro cycles, you go to run into his natural, and where most players would have nothing there, Innovation has a whole mini army. And this is something Startail Life was famous for, was constantly counterattacking. everything, and knifing into your natural and running lings into your base. And that was one reason why he couldn't beat Inno in their game last match, because holy shit, a huge mine onto the mutas. Oh my god, a sea of blood! And that's what I'm talking about. 2 mutas, it's a fucking massacre. Life kept trying to counterattack. Innovation's macro was so good. Inno always had stuff there. How do you beat a counterattacking player? You macro perfectly, Kappa. I absolutely love to see that match where we saw both players' stylistic tendencies and really what they're known for more than anything else be the defining factor and play a major role in their game. And here, Innovation has perfectly defended the Muta harass. He hit at the power trough, making RorO unable to produce a ton of mutas right whenever his Spire finished, and then he buttoned up with turrets. The mutas did no damage, and Innovation's economy has been untouched. He's been a powerhouse all game with the huge pre-split. Notice he's mixing in tank and mine. This was an absolutely disgusting combo going into his 3-3, which will finish before the Zerg. The Zerg's doing that classic thing where he hasn't gotten anything done in the mid game. He's been pushed back a lot, and he's like trying to go into Ultra, but the Terran's ahead of him eco-wise, tech-wise, and is going to have better upgrades and more units than he will. And Innovation surges forward a jaw-dropping amount of units. His Inno's up about 30 supply here, and he's continuing to press with the mines, and the mutas will come forward here and try to clean this up, but there's not enough on the ground. Innovation pops all the mutas, and this is going to be it. His Inno crushes RorO in the first game, and GG is called. This was the perfect prototypical Innovation W. Open Hellion fast for third CC, which, by the way, I love doing these innovation casts. I can talk about the history of the game for the first 5 minutes. If it's ZVT, guys, you know what the fuck's happening. Innovation's going Hellion. If there's a Roachall in, I'll let you know. But Innovation's going to go Hellion and control his opponent. That's a very control, safe, standard macro opener. I'm going to make over 6 Hellions, get a fast third, walk around, get map control. And you've got to love and respect that from Innovation. It's the standard, easy way to get into the biggest crushing macro advantage possible, and it's the way that suits his style as far as being a late game macro player. RorO tried what he could, but really was on the back foot all game, and that's a frustrating thing because he was on the back foot from a guy who didn't want to attack till 10 minutes, and usually Zerg players want to do that, and whenever you face a person who is very placid and doesn't make a lot happen but just contains you and then belts you but also can't be cheesed, it feels impossible to win. So we'll see if RorO can come back. Innovation just beat Flash in Life. He's trying to tee up the defending champion. Sub for more.